Hi, I'm Guy Pools, one of the cinematographers on Two Sentence Horror Stories, and you're listening to Go Creative Show.
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Consoli. I'm a director and owner of BC Media Productions. This is the Go Creative Show, the show dedicated to creative professionals and filmmakers. Today we celebrate Halloween with Guy Pools, the director of photography for the anthology series Two Sentence Horror Stories. The Go Creative Show is supported by Hedge, Shutterstock, Rule Boston Camera, and Premium Beat. Well, happy Halloween, everybody. This is a little bonus episode for you guys today here in October. We usually only do weekly shows, and we still will certainly do that. But every once in a while, you're going to get these little bonus episodes, and this is a good one. We've got Guy Pools. He's the director of photography for Two Sentence Horror Stories. It's a really cool concept. If you guys haven't heard of the show, you should definitely be checking it out because entire episodes are built on this two-sentence story that sort of gets fleshed out and turned into a full episode. And it's an anthology series, similar to like a Black Mirror, thriller, horror stuff. Really, really cool. So my conversation with Guy is awesome. I mean, he talks to us a lot about how he does his pre-production. So he talks about, his overhead diagrams and storyboards, his approach to horror cinematography, and a lot about the way that he approaches an anthology series. Keeping consistency across episodes, but also making sure that each one is unique enough to stand on its own. So it's a great discussion, perfect for Halloween, and we are so happy that Guy is on the show to talk about it. But before we get there, I want to talk about Shutterstock. Yes, Shutterstock. Shutterstock has over 16 million royalty-free video clips. You heard me right. 16 million. Yes, and many of them are in 4K, which is awesome for those of us that are shooting in 4K and now editing and delivering in 4K. It's becoming more and more of a necessity for us filmmakers, and it's great to know that you can go to Shutterstock for 4K clips, and a lot of them. In fact, they add about 100,000 clips a week. So think about it. That 16 million is going to be 17, 19, 20, 25. It's going to add up, people. But I want to draw your attention to Shutterstock Elements because these are cinema-grade video effects for filmmakers. You can plop them into any of your NLEs, and they look so good. I mean, these are blockbuster quality video effects, and they're created by industry professionals. So I'm talking about 4K lens flares, transitions, video kits like smoke, fire, explosions. They're all there at Shutterstock.com. So while you're there, getting inspired, reading their blog, looking at their stock footage and photos and listening to their music, I want you to also check out Shutterstock Elements. It's all there over at Shutterstock.com. All right, let's dive in, people, shall we? To our interview with Guy Pools, the director of photographer for Two Sentence Horror Stories. So I'm here with Guy Pools. He is the director of photography for Two Sentence Horror Stories. Guy, thank you so much for being on.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'd love to know what Two Sentence Horror Stories, like how do you describe what it is? Because the name is very unique and sort of draws you in, especially around this time, October. People are thinking about horror movies, Halloween, all of that. What is the premise of the show?
Yes, well, it all derived from a sort of internet writing fad or prompt, I think that came from Reddit, where, members of a community would challenge each other by saying what the scariest horror story was that could be written within just 2 sentences.
Wow.
Our showrunner and the show's creator, Vera Meow, discovered this and was really inspired by it and wanted to see if there was a way she could use this concept by taking these 2-sentence horror stories and using them as an inspiration for writing 20-minute episodes of a television series.
What was the thought behind 20 minutes?
Well, initially it started as a web series in 2017 that I was lucky enough to be a part of. Those episodes were a little bit shorter, around 15 minutes. When it got picked up by the CW, I think they decided that to fill their half-hour time slot, 20 minutes in terms of episode content would be appropriate. But I think the short-form format lends itself quite well to the sort of brevity of the two sentence format. I think it sort of still captures the spirit of the minimalism of the two sentences without, but also allows room to sort of expand and turn it into essentially a short film.
Yeah. Now, how do the episodes work together? Like, are they individual or do they all tell one cohesive story per season?
No, there are. It's an anthology series, so each episode is entirely self-contained. They're often written by entirely different people, directed by different directors, with a whole new cast and narrative for each episode.
And I think what makes that so cool from your perspective is you are now able to kind of create new looks for each episode that you work on. You aren't bound by kind of a lookbook for a series. Does that appeal to you, or is there something kind of nice about sort of knowing the look that you're going to have over the course of an entire series?
Well, actually, what we're touching upon there is sort of what the biggest challenge of the show was. We wanted the show to feel sort of cohesive in terms of the aesthetic that branched over the entire season between me and the other cinematographer, Paul Yee. But obviously, when you have a whole new narrative, a whole new cast, director, a whole new script, there's going to be natural sort of deviations in the aesthetic of each episode.
Sure.
And the struggle really became, how do we, all of the creative department heads and the directors and the showrunner, how do we work together to make these different narratives still feel like they're part of the same world? We went about that. Vera built a very thorough sort of lookbook for the show. And we talked a lot about visual references and just sort of how we wanted the show to feel in terms of, lighting, exposure, color palette, contrast. And together we were able to sort of form rules that we were to adhere to. And each episode in its own way can deviate from those rules as its narrative begins to sort of unfold. But we very much use the kind of rules in terms of the visual language of the show as like a starting point to leap off from.
What were some of the constants?
The constants were sort of like embracing day interiors and exteriors as if they were perhaps to be exposed a little bit darker than you might expect. We embraced sort of minimalism of color palette. We really tried to mute the colors of the show unless there was a reason to really have a strong saturated color for a narrative reason. We tried to, in a similar level, pull red out of the show completely unless there were moments where we were really making a statement about what red meant within the episode.
Yeah.
And me and the other cinematographer embraced a pretty punchy and high contrast ratio for our exposure between our key light and our fill.
And then you bring that across each episode. I'm looking through stills from the episodes that you had shot. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a little bit of a consistency in framing too, a little bit. Like I think you've got some really good wides. You have sort of that center, the people in the center, balance on the frame. I'm seeing some similarities there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we sort of also set the rule that we're not going to move the camera unless there's really a reason to do it. So I think naturally that lent itself to sort of figuring out what arresting compositions could be, embracing strong wides and having them make a statement rather than maybe a Steadicam or dolly move all of the time. Yeah, absolutely.
Talk to me about the way that this show kind of comes together from a pre-production standpoint. We don't often get to hear the ins and outs of all of that. And I'd love to dive in about what is your approach from episode to episode? How does it begin?
Well, on this, it was a very tight pre-production schedule. I got the phone call from Vera telling me that the show was going into production in New York just over 2 weeks before we started shooting, and she asked if I could fly over immediately to begin pre-production, which I did. Yeah, and I mean, the first thing is getting everyone on the same page. So you sit down together with all of the new directors, the production designer, the costume designer, the two cinematographers. Everyone sits down together and we essentially go through what the vision for the show is to be. We share visual references with each other and make sure that we all know exactly what the intention is and that we're all really just making the same show. And from there, it becomes, um, just you go straight into designing your visual language with each individual different director and scouting locations and making sure that we can achieve what we want to achieve for the budget of the show, which was not a huge budget, um, but also do justice to what is on the page of the script.
Now, when you're doing something like this and each episode kind of lives on its own, do you go and scout, let's just say for just scouting purposes, do you go and scout locations for all of the episodes you're working on at the same time? Or do you really compartmentalize it into one set of pre-production per episode?
Well, on this schedule, it had to happen at the same time. All of the episodes were shot. Well, essentially, it was divided into two shooting units. So I had 4 episodes to shoot, and the other cinematographer also had 4 episodes to shoot. But both of those productions would happen on top of each other at the same time, and all of those episodes for each unit shot back to back. So all of the pre-production for all of the episodes had to happen at the same time. We were sort of going back and forth. One day we would scout for one episode, or maybe even the morning of that day we would scout one episode, and the afternoon we would be scouting locations for another. Sometimes we would have multiple directors in the same pass van coming along for the ride for one location scout so they could be ready to scout the next later in the day. It was all a sort of very intricately planned pre-production schedule that could essentially get us the most amount of efficiency out of the short time that we had in which to work.
It sounds it, yeah. I mean, when you're working with tight budgets, short time frames, you really have to get a lot done. And it's amazing what you guys are able to output under those constraints. I mean, the look of the show is awesome.
Thank you.
It looks really high end. In fact, what I kind of got from it was it seems inspired by House of Cards. I don't know if you are a fan of that show, but if you aren't, I think you might be pulling from them without even really realizing it. There's the camera doesn't move that much, the super wide angles, the darkness. There's a lot there that's very reminiscent of that show to me, and also Breaking Bad. Those are the two that kind of popped into my head as I was watching it. Both amazing shows to reference from, but that's what I was seeing. What were you referencing from?
Well, yeah, I mean, thank you for those comparisons, by the way. Yeah, I mean, House of Cards is an interesting one. Sort of David Fincher, most recent David Fincher projects in general tend to lend themselves to a lot of the same rules that we were embracing. I don't know if sort of things like House of Cards or Mindhunter were specific references we were using, but they definitely would have fallen within the wheelhouse of what we were looking at.
What were you using?
I remember one large reference that almost all of the directors turned to was the work of Lynn Ramsay. We were looking at Ratcatcher. We were looking at, we need to talk about Kevin. We were looking at all of her work, really, specifically in how she'll juxtapose a very beautifully composed wide master with a very subjective, unsettling feeling insert shot.
Yeah.
And then when it sort of came to color palette and composition, a big reference for Vera was First Reformed, the Paul Schrader film. I think she really enjoyed that film and really liked the minimalism of the production design and the palette and the contrast of the lighting, specifically within sort of day interiors. I think, and there was a lot of stills photography we were looking at by a lot of other photographers, but those were sort of the main two that I recall. Yeah.
I want to talk about the way that you approach cinematography for horror, because, a lot of times you see horror films with the shaky cam, a lot of action in the camera, and you're almost like using the camera as a tool to create a sense of tension and make things scarier than they actually are. You guys don't do that at all. Like your camera, you don't have a lot of camera movement, as we talked about. You let the scenes linger. And I think that provides, an area where you're trusting the talent and you're trusting the cinematography so much because you're not trying to guide the audience with camera movements. That's a bold move. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how you've crafted that look and your approach to cinematography for tension and horror and fear.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, when it comes to really my general approach to the cinematography of Two Sentence or any horror property that I might be involved in, it's really the same as any genre in which I might work, which is you're always focused on the drama and the tension of the narrative, no matter if you're shooting a story that's a romance or a comedy. It's always all about drama and tension. And the best way to do that, I think, is always just going to be where is the most subjective place I can put the camera in order to bring the viewer into sort of the headspace of what our protagonist is feeling at any given moment. And that might be literally shooting a shot from what their physical point of view might be geographically within the location, or it might be more just picking a focal length that somewhat evokes how they might be feeling in a moment, and then thinking about what your proximity to them as a character is, or sort of how far away from them you might be. You can do an awful lot if you just sort of take a moment to think about where to place the camera. It'll do a lot of the work for you, I think.
And when you say place the camera, so are you involved in the blocking of scenes? Do you go to rehearsals at all? Like, do you think about, do you need to have that information about where the talent is way ahead of time to plan your shots?
I like to, yeah. I mean, it makes life a lot easier for me. And certainly on this project, our pre-production was so brief that it was a necessity. I was working with all of the directors to build overheads based on the locations that we had chosen to decide sort of how they envisioned the blocking.
Okay.
And from there, I would work with them to, sort of build a shot list, talk about the visual language, and essentially design the cinematography of the episode. And through that might come suggestions to tweak some blocking, usually if it meant condensing our shot count for each scene and day. But it is the way I prefer to work, although it is, you don't want to stifle the director. You don't want them to feel like they're locked into something just because you've predetermined a version of the blocking sort of 3 days in advance or something like that.
Yeah.
But it does, once you know what the blocking is, it makes it far easier to design a visual language that is telling the story. Sometimes, and it even happens on a show like Two Sentence, which was a very tight schedule, but the blocking we've decided just doesn't work for whatever reason, and it has to be rethought and reblocked. And we take the time to do that, and then from scratch, we'll, based on the new blocking, try and decide what the visual language is. But you do always have the feeling that in the heat of being on set, surrounded by, a first AD, an entire crew, you're always behind schedule. Maybe the sort of pressure of that is preventing you a little bit from making sober choices about what the best way to visually tell the story would be. I do prefer to sort of do it in a quieter environment with just myself and the director, so that we have time to think about our work and sleep on it and make sure that we're making the right choices.
So you have to have a synergy with your director to really make that work, because there may be times when the director really doesn't want to be, I hate to even say bogged down, but I don't know what else to say there, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. You may have a director that says, you know what, I want this to feel organic. I want my actors to use their space. I don't want to worry about having perfect blocking. Have you been in those situations? And then how do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. My approach to that way of working, which again is a way of working that has an enormous benefit to the film for so many reasons. But my approach to that is usually to, even if we're going to take a looser approach to the cinematography in terms of the design of it, and we're just going to allow things to unfold and sort of let the blocking happen as it happens, the actors land where they land, and thus also the camera.
Yeah.
I do try and, in pre-production with the director, maybe at least agree on some broad visual rules that we can always try and stick to. Sort of what is the most sort of vital or pivotal moment in the entire film. How is our cinematography leading up to that moment different from everything that happens after it?
Sure.
Just create some very broad visual rules for us at least to cling to and fall back upon, even if it is maybe more of a, you could even say documentary-esque type of way of working at times, you know. And I find as long as you, because that's the thing, is a large part of why it's so important to have long conversations about the visual language in pre-production with the director is really just to make sure that the two of you know what the movie is you're both trying to make and that you're on the same page. Yeah. Even if all of the work you've created sort of gets thrown out of the window the minute you get onto set, it's about having had those conversations so that, you know, myself as a cinematographer, I know what the things are that are most important to the director.
Beyond that overhead that you were talking about, and just to kind of, for the people that don't know, I'll let you explain it. What is that overhead and how is it working for you? Just, we'll get that out of the way and then I'll go to the next thing, just in case people don't know what that means.
An overhead, it's a very sort of clinical, sterile way of approaching the cinematography and blocking of a scene. It's essentially a bird's eye view of, for each shot, where all of the actors in the scene are going to be standing, usually represented as little dots or something upon the page, and where they will be moving to within the sort of geography of the location, and then also where the camera will be in relation to them and where it'll move from and to, if it does move at all. And then you're looking at that sort of overhead diagram. And the great thing about it is you can, once you've built it, give it to every single department head, and everybody on the set will know at all times what next shot we're moving on to, as well as what direction we're looking in for that shot, what part of the room needs to be dressed, what actors are in the shot. And it's just a really efficient way of communicating what is needed for every shot in order to make your schedule.
Beyond that overhead, do you make, previs videos? Do you make animatics? Do you do anything like that to also sort of inform the way that you're going to shoot?
I love doing, if there's time, I love doing video storyboards with directors. Rarely ever is there time. So if that does occur, it's usually for quite complicated sequences like a fight scene or some set piece that we really need to know exactly what the shots are in order to piece the sequence together in terms of fragments. But I think it's a great way of working. And if you can do that in pre-production, and then kind of bring it to an editor, hopefully the editor who will be working on the show with you, and piece it together, it'll instantly tell you whether your ideas and plan for the sequence or for the scene will work, or if you need to rethink it. It's a great dry run at what you're doing.
I've only done those for commercials, and that's mostly what I do anyway, but anything like longer form, which for me is like 2 minutes plus, I usually don't, but having those previs, the animatics are awesome, especially for commercial when you're really tied to 30 seconds or whatever it may be. It just helps you on timing a lot. And I also find that it helps you from overshooting. Like you don't end up leaving with hours and hours of footage when you don't need it. And when I'm watching your work, the way it's crafted and how specific everything looks and feels, it seems to me like you are not a big overshooter. It seems like you get what you need and then you move on. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's different from project to project based on the way the director might like to work. But certainly on Two Sentence, there just simply wasn't the time to cover everything from multiple different angles. And, at times, as you, I'm sure, can see in certain scenes, there's one shot and then that's the entire scene. There's no time even for a second angle. And so it becomes about, all right, if there's only one shot we can get because of time to tell the story of this scene, where is the best place to put the camera and how do we do that? But simply it means that in pre-production, you're always sort of editing with the director in your head as you're building the shot list. And sort of coming up with ways in which you might be able to save time by not photographing the entire scene from one angle because it's only going to be used right at the tail end of the scene as sort of a moment of punctuation or a transition, something like that.
Let's take a quick moment and talk about Hedge. Hedge is a backup software for filmmakers. It's super fast, super easy. And you can keep track of all your transfers because they've got these really fantastic transfer logs too. But the big thing is you can import multiple sources and send it to multiple destinations at the same time. So think about it. You're on set and your camera operators are giving you media cards. Your audio techs are giving you media cards. You have a behind-the-scenes photographer giving you media cards. And now you need to make sure that everything is backed up correctly. Now, before Hedge, I was just dragging files all over the Finder. Now, if that is the way you work, then I suggest you make a change. My whole entire workflow is different now. It's better now because of Hedge. With Hedge, I can import multiple sources and send it to multiple destinations all at the same time. So you're looking at the Hedge app, and you've got the left-hand side is where all of your sources go, all of those media cards we talked about. And on the right-hand side is your destinations. And for me, I like to have 2 backups, so I have 2 drives. I press transfer, and I just let it go. I just let it go. When it's done, I get a notification on my phone. I know it's done correctly. I don't have to worry. It's so much better than dragging files around the Finder like a maniac, right? It's time to treat your media professionally. Use Hedge. Upgrade your backup workflow with Hedge over at hedge.video. Now, if you go to hedge.video/Go Creative Show or type Go Creative Show in the coupon area, the coupon code at checkout, you get 20% off the full license. They've got a variety of licenses, but you get 20% off the full license. So there is nothing stopping you. Head over to hedge.video/Go Creative Show and enjoy. And before we get back to our interview, I want to quickly mention Rule Boston Camera. Yes, Rule is the place to go to purchase and rent all of your production equipment. They've got a huge inventory, a ridiculous inventory of products. Because here's the thing. When Hollywood films come through Boston, they use Rule. They do. So if it's good enough for the Hollywood films, it's good enough for us, right? Of course. And they've got everything you could ever imagine. But what they have that a lot of people don't is their customer service. They're going to give you expert advice and counsel in pre-production. They're going to give you technical guidance when you take the equipment out on your shoot, and they are committed to support you throughout the entire time that you have their gear. They are an extension of you. They are a production partner. And that's why we love those guys. So world-class inventory, amazing customer support. It's all there at rule.com. So check it out for yourself at rule.com. All right, let's get back to our interview. So much more to talk about with Guy Pools, the director of photography for 2-Sentence Horror Stories. All right, so I want to take a couple minutes and talk about one of the most challenging scenes that you had in the series. And everything that we talk about, all of your episodes, the entire season 1 is all on Netflix. So you guys can go and check this out after we talk about it too and just kind of see what we're referencing. So pick an episode, pick a scene, and let's dive into it.
Okay, yeah. So I think a good scene to talk about is a scene from Cyan. It's a scene where 2 of the characters are sort of snooping around the head doctor's office, without her permission while she's not there, in terms of trying to find answers to the mystery of the episode.
What made this scene so challenging? And what was going on?
So the big challenge for me was sort of the deception of the scene in terms of how it played upon the page versus what it actually needed to shoot. This scene upon the page of the episode was, I'd say, not even half a page. It was probably just over a quarter. And thus, the time allotted to shoot this scene of the day was, appropriately scheduled based upon the page length, because we didn't always have time to sit down with the AD department to schedule things based upon the shot list that the directors and I had come up with. Sometimes they wouldn't have even seen the final shot list until a day or the day of shooting, maybe. So this scene actually is deceptive because although it seems like not a lot happens in this scene, you have 2 characters sneaking into a room. One goes over to one direction, the other goes over to another. Both have different eye lines looking at different things. There's a door that is noticed at one point. There is a book that is opened and looked at. One character falls down and starts having a seizure. The other runs to his aid. A nurse comes in. There are so many different eye lines to points of tension and conflict and interest within the scene, not to mention just between the two characters, that photographing it in a efficient way, hopefully in a way that didn't use more than about 4 or 5 shots, became a real challenge.
And it's interesting too, because people don't think about how the viewer needs to understand where you are on set, where you are in the scene. And in this scene, I agree with you. You have each person's looking at different things. They're not looking at each other for a majority of the scene. And you have the door that's extraordinarily important, and also knowing where the door is in comparison to where they are in the scene. It sounds simple, and when you watch it, it doesn't seem like it would be particularly challenging. But as you break it down, you realize that those are very hard things to establish in cinematography. Where are we? Especially when it's a series of close-ups. How do you approach that? One thing I noticed is that you had props that anchored you. Like there's this lamp in the scene, and when you see the lamp, you kind of know where you are in the room, and that to me stuck out as an anchor prop to help me understand where I am. Was that true, or am I picking up on something that doesn't really exist? That happens a lot too.
No, that's exactly right. You know that there's not going to be any, if you set up a nice wide master for this one scene, it might get used, but based on how many different places within the room the scene had to take place, not to mention that there was no efficient way to photograph them coming through the door from the master because it's sort of around a corner of the location. It just felt like it was not going to be utilized within the edit. So then it became, all right, how do we establish where we are, and establish before you cut to the next shot where the characters are coming from with the last shot, and using the pools of light within the scene and sort of the props of the desk at which he's standing before you cut to a new angle that you sort of haven't really established yet became like a vital tool for sort of orienting yourself.
It's also a lesson in editing too. I mean, a good editor is going to know how to put this together, but it's a scene without a master, and that's always challenging.
Yeah. It would have been great to get a master that tied everything together. I think it would have made the scene better. But we just decided that there were so many beats to cover within this one scene that there just wasn't time. And also the geography and layout of the room just didn't lend itself to one angle that efficiently sort of covered everything. It would have involved maybe laying a dolly track and having it be a moving master that tracked through the scene, and there just simply wasn't time. So it was a really deceptive scene in terms of how complicated it was going to be. And there were a lot of those, especially on this show.
And something else about that episode, and this is again season 1, episode 5. The title is Scion. There's also this kind of like mist fog sort of filtering effect on the cinematography. I'd love to talk to you about that and what led you to that decision.
Yeah, Natalia, the director, had a great idea that she really wanted, as our protagonist's journey through the story sort of fell more into disorientation and confusion. She wanted just everything to get sort of hazier and visually to reflect the sort of fog of confusion that the protagonist was existing in. And initially, our plan was to utilize haze and simply drastically increase the level of haze throughout the episode in sort of a gradient that took us up to the climax at the end. However, based on sort of the shooting laws of New York and the location in which we were in, the location couldn't afford us haze within the location without a very expensive sort of fire rep being on set. So we sort of, for budgetary reasons, had to 86 that idea and embrace something else last minute. And the solution I suggested was that we use simply in front of the lens filtration to, slowly increase and replicate a similar sort of fogging effect. And we utilized that through, we did that through the utilization of both smoke filters and fog filters, taking us all the way up to, I think, a fog 3 for the film's climax, which is a very heavy filter. I mean, I can't imagine ever using a filter that dense in any other type of narrative situation. But it was really fun to work sort of with that effect and light accordingly to it. It was something I hadn't really done before.
Did it make you nervous doing something so heavy on camera and it cannot be removed? Did that scare you at all?
Yeah. But you're always doing that. You place a light in a position, and that's doing essentially the same thing. You can't undo that. So yeah, it did, but I knew it was narratively driven. So even though if somebody objected to the effect after the fact, maybe upon seeing the edit, we could at least assure ourselves that we had made a decision based on what we felt was right for the story. So that was really all that mattered.
Did you get any pushback on it?
A lot of people on set might walk past the monitor and kind of give me a look, but I think people responded positively to it. I mean, it's the sort of thing where if you just look at the monitor, it feels very apparent, but the sort of effect of watching the entire episode means you become accustomed to it. So as it gets stronger a little bit throughout the episode, it doesn't as much punch you in the face as it would have if you just suddenly looked at it for the first time.
Let's take a couple minutes and talk about your camera package. Did you use the same camera on all of your episodes? And if so, what was it?
Yeah, it was an Alexa Mini. Paulie, the other cinematographer, and I think we just decided that given the vast number of shooting situations, locations, day, night, exterior, interior, we just figured it was the most versatile camera. Not only does it give you, just a beautiful image naturally, but it's a camera you can put in almost any situation, and you won't be sad that it's the camera you've chosen. The only real differences between the 4 episodes Paul shot and the 4 episodes that I shot were a lens package. On my 4 episodes, I used Zeiss Super Speeds, and I believe Paul embraced Cooke S4s. We simply, I wanted to embrace super speeds for the speed of stop, because I knew based on my episodes I was going to have a lot of night exteriors, and I was worried about, based on the speed at which we were moving, locations I hadn't scouted yet, and our small lighting package that I just was going to need every photon of light I could muster from the image. But we, I think at the last minute, our rental house didn't quite have 2 sets of the same lens system. So Paul embraced S4s, and I think we agreed that the 2 lens systems, although quite different, were close enough that nobody would be bumped by the difference of optical quality between the 2 lens systems.
Were you shooting 4K?
Well, yes. I mean, as native as the 4K can be within an Alexa Mini, like 3.8K. I believe we were in 16:9 mode. I don't think we did open gate. No. Yeah. I think that's correct.
So you grabbed as much as you could out of that sensor.
Yeah, I think. I mean, also coming off the way that the first web series version of this show started back in LA in 2017, I knew that the speed at which we were going to have to move meant giving editorial the broadest amount of latitude possible, and that included resolution, because that they're going to need to do digital punches in or digital zooms at certain moments within the episode, so you want to give them that flexibility.
Did you test any other camera before ultimately deciding on the Alexa Mini?
No, we didn't. We had used the Alexa Mini, Vera and I, on the sort of first web series version of it, and I think she was pretty happy with the aesthetic of that show as at least a starting point. So we sort of used that as our leaping off point and decided that it was probably just the best camera. And Paul and I have both worked with that camera a bunch, and on a show with such a tight prep schedule, there simply wasn't the time for us to go and test a bunch of new shooting formats. I know Paul did some testing of sort of night vision cameras for certain parts of an episode that he shot, but I think that was all that we were really able to do.
Do you operate your camera, or are you acting just as DP and then you have a separate operator?
I always prefer to work with a separate operator. I know a lot of DPs love to operate themselves. I much prefer to work with an operator. I just find that a professional operator is going to be able to do a camera move, in my opinion, far better than I ever would. But what I really like the most about it is just how it frees you up for communication. If I'm, especially on a smaller, low-budget project, you're always packed into tiny rooms and surrounded by lighting equipment. So if you're trapped behind the camera, you just don't have the ability to go and talk to the director, to talk to the first AD, to talk to the gaffer. It just sort of like hinders you. And I always like to be right next to the director at monitor, so that if they have any, concern or query, they can just point to it and ask me about it. Or sometimes it's as simple as you see an expression on their face and you can see that they're not quite happy about something, but they haven't said anything yet, and you can sort of preempt that by asking them what's wrong. I just like to be in as close a communication with the director as possible.
So what was the makeup of your camera department? You had your operator. Did you have an additional person pulling focus?
Yeah, it was. I was able to bring the camera operator I work with a lot, Colin O, who's also a brilliant cinematographer in his own right. I was able to bring him over from LA. And then I had a brilliant first AC, Colton, and a second AC for the run of show.
Let's talk a little bit about lighting. We keep referencing the fact that the show is very fast moving. You had to kind of, use shot economy here and there to get the show done. How did that translate on the lighting standpoint? Were you carrying around a smaller lighting package that was kind of for everything, or were you individually lighting scenes based on what their needs were?
Yeah, it was a smaller lighting package. Occasionally, if memory serves, we might have rented an additional M18 for sort of maybe some day interior shots, specifically in, I think, Scion, where a lot of the rooms had quite giant windows and we needed to balance some stuff. Yeah. But yeah, it was a small lighting package, almost entirely comprised of LEDs, although there were a couple of smaller HMI units on our truck. But yeah, between sort of light mats and Astera tubes, that was how the majority of our lighting setups were created. And then from there on out, we were just utilizing our faster f-stop on our super speeds to embrace the natural light that we get from practical sources or just from a window.
Have you explored any of like the LED Fresnels at all, or the so-called HMI replacements?
No. I never. I mean, I've tested a couple of them on certain projects, but I've never really pulled any out with me. In my opinion, they're great. I think the technology is fantastic. I'm really excited about it. But both in terms of the punch you get from the sort of an RE LED Fresnel, it's not maybe, in my opinion, quite worth the price tag of a rental for it yet. I would much rather just have a source of light with more punch and then shape it how I want. But I know they just released essentially an LED LECO unit that I'm very excited about looking at. But no, I mean, LED technology in terms of Fresnel units, in my opinion, still has a little way to go before I would carry a lot with me. But they're great lights, and I'm sure it'll get there very, very soon.
I know just before this interview, I did an interview with the Matt Allard from newsshooter.com. I don't know if you're a fan of that site, but they do a lot of production gear coverage and all that. And they were at IBC, and we talked quite a bit about the orbiter, the ARRI orbiter, which is like their
right.
I mean, was that what you were talking about? It looks amazing. It looks complicated too, though. You know what I mean? It's like, I remember a day, because I've been doing this for a while, so I remember a day when you just had like a low light kit or like a bunch of airy tungsten lights. You just threw them up and that was the end of it. I mean, these are computers.
Right.
They're computers that just happen to have a light attached. It's pretty
Yeah.
mind-blowing.
Yeah. I mean, even on our, tiny budget production, I mean, our gaffer had just purchased some Astera
I love
tubes,
those.
and oh, they're fantastic, and we use them for pretty much every single setup. But you control those as well, just from an iPad that you have with you at all times. So yeah, I mean, what it means is, especially on lower budget productions, every member of the lighting crew needs to have at least a vague knowledge of the computer software needed to operate these units. Otherwise, they won't be able to do their jobs.
Yeah.
There can't just be one person on set who knows how to use the iPad in order to control the Asteras, because what if they're sick that day? What if they have to go to the bathroom or something like that? Um, but yeah, I mean, it's amazing the way technology has evolved, even in just like the last 3 years. And a show like this would not have been able to have been made the way that it was, in my opinion, without those advances in LED technology. If we were lugging large tungsten or HMI units around for the entire production, we would not have been able to move as quickly, and we would have needed a generator for the entire run of show, which we did not have. And yeah, it would have been a completely different animal of production.
You are listening to the PremiumBeat.com Song of the Week. It's called Giraffes by Harrison Ammer. Premium Beat is where to go for all of your royalty-free music and sound effects. You can visit their collection of thousands of royalty-free tracks at PremiumBeat.com. The tracks are only $49 each. Yes, $49. And you get so much more. You get loop sets, cut downs, stems, so you can customize the track to fit your project perfectly. It's all there at PremiumBeat.com. I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about the color palette. There's
Okay.
a strong color palette in the show, I think. And yes, each episode stands on its own. It's, different actors, different everything. But there is some consistency, and we talked about that earlier in this episode. One of those things I feel like is the color palette. You're not necessarily using the exact same color palette, but I think what makes it consistent is that how dedicated you are to that color palette when you land on it. Like it is so specific, and the whole episode adheres to it. So I want to talk to you about the way that you work with your colorist. First off, are you creating a custom LUT that you use on set? Like, where does your color palette come from, and how do you craft it?
Well, that's interesting. That was actually a conversation Paul and I had in pre-production in the run-up to the photography beginning. We were discussing whether we should build and embrace a specific LUT for the show, and then we were sort of going back and forth, emailing each other options and talking about what qualities from this LUT might be, and what we were looking for. But then I think we just decided that between the two of us, there were so many different shooting environments that if we did pick or build a specific LUT, one of us is probably going to wind up in a situation where that LUT is just doing something very strange. And I think we just decided to default back to the 709 look for our dailies. And honestly, that's usually the way I work anyway. I'm just, so familiar with a 709 LUT at this point that, looking at a monitor and looking at my light meter, I know really exactly what I'm getting in terms of exposure, and there are no curveballs. So that was fine with me. And then the other added benefit is, once you get into color, it's really only going to look better, because 709 is although, scientifically great for judging your exposure, maybe not the most attractive thing to look at all the time. So yeah, It was just a simple 709 LUT,
So
and
you've
then
got a
all the
dailies LUT of 709, and then are you working, like, do you have the opportunity to go and sit with the colorist and work frame by frame on this show?
yeah. Production were generous enough because all of post was done out of New York, so production were generous enough to bring me back over from LA to New York for all of the color grade
That's
sessions.
nice.
So it was very nice, and I would have been, unhappy if that hadn't have been the case. I mean, it's literally 50% of the job, in my opinion. You expose your image, and then you treat your image, and those are the two halves of how you create the image in itself. So anytime that I'm not able to be there in part of color, it's very sad. Yeah, I always fight to be there if I can.
And when it doesn't happen, how do you deal with it? Like, do they
Hmm.
just send you, do they just send you stills? Do they send you clips? And then you're kind of bound to whatever system you're watching it on to make comments on. I mean, that's got to suck for the
Yeah,
colorist too, because it's like, you don't know what your person's watching it on, you know?
yeah, yeah. It sucks. It sucks for everyone. What I just try and communicate in as much detail as possible. I'll take stills from the show, as many as possible, and sort of draw all over them, and sort of tell them what I'm looking for. Maybe do a rough grade of like vague approximations of what I'm looking for, and then of course always dictate the display and the calibration upon which I have done all of this on, and so that they have some context for what it is that I've been looking at when I've been talking about this. Um, yeah, it gets messy, but it happens. It happens, vaguely frequently. So you just sort of have your way of working with it, which is really just as much communication as can humanly be achieved between you, the director, and the
What I've
colorist.
noticed about your color palette is you have that kind of like soft, cloudy daylight blue look.
Mm-hmm,
You've got that
mm-hmm,
kind of warm tungsteny look. And then every once in a while, you've got a pop of red. And there's two
mm-hmm.
spots, two episodes in particular that really highlight that red. I think episode 3, Legacy, you have like this candle, this not real candle, but like they're candlelight candelabras with incandescent lights on it that have a red hue
Right.
to it that pop in
Mm-hmm,
various angles of the show in that episode.
mm-hmm.
And then you also have in episode 1, you don't focus on it too much, but it's there. There's a scene where our main character, the gentleman in this case, is on his bed. Oh no, it's not his bed. It's on a bed, I guess, of his first victim.
Mm-hmm.
And you have like those red kind of Christmas lights behind him. And it's really cool because when you limit your color palette to just a few things, those pops are so impactful. I'd love to get your
Mm-hmm.
thoughts on sort of how those came to be.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of the reason why you do limit your color palette, is so that you can then, from that limited standpoint, begin to evolve the story visually by introducing new colors and assigning meaning to those colors. And obviously, red. I mean, red is just about the most powerful color you can use on the
Yeah.
screen. It has such a graphic weight to it that the minute you pull it out completely from an image, it has a significant impact upon the color palette just by doing that alone. And then when you do introduce that in, it really holds a lot of weight. Yeah, I mean, within each episode, the presence of red means something a little different based on the visual language of that specific
Sure.
episode, but it certainly is a very potent color across the series, and has a lot of significance every time it does show up. I mean, I did like what happened in the use of it in the first episode, Gentleman, because we embraced it for that sort of disturbing episode where he murders the woman in the first act of the
Yeah.
episode. There are The editor was then able to sort of lay fragmented sort of like flashbacks to that scene out throughout the episode
Yeah.
following. And every time you have those sort of like brief glimpses of the violence that happened, you get the sudden pop of red as well, which I felt worked really well. I thought that was really nice.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to end with our kind of now, it's becoming like our thing here at Go Creative Show, where we ask our guests, what is the one piece of gear? What is the one tool that you take with you on every shoot, and why?
Interesting. I mean, it would have to be my light meter. I mean, uh, yeah, I think I would be completely lost without it. I mean, I can use a waveform, I can use false color, but once you get used to your way of working, that becomes your sort of comfort zone. And for me, it's the light meter. I'm able to pre-light scenes before the camera is built. I'm able to take light readings on location scouts. It's just for the independent low budget cinematographer, it's invaluable. Yeah, I love my light meter, and I wouldn't know what I would do.
What kind is it? Give it a little plug.
It is Sekonic. It is what model is it? I can never remember the random series of numbers that come with it, but it's not the touch screen. It's the older generation of Cine
Look at you
model
with the
of,
old school equipment. I love it. I love that. I wish I knew how to really use it. I mean, I like the idea of using a light meter, but I never do. It's really, I'm moving fast. I'm looking at it at the monitor and I'm like, you know what? Whatever, it's there. Plus, I don't shoot a lot. You know what I mean? Like, I'm mostly directing or producing. So I'm not as invested in like the actual, like, perfect, color temperature of everything and exposure of everything. I kind of leave that to the DPs as I should. But I like the idea of it. Like, I want to get better at really understanding.
Yeah. I mean, for anyone out there that wants to get into shooting, I know light meters are expensive, but they really are invaluable. I mean, it just allows you to move so much faster because if you don't have a light meter, all of your measurement of exposure comes from literally just the camera itself. And let's say, the AC needs to swing a lens or clean a filter or change a battery and power down the camera. Well, then you have to sort of wait around for 2 minutes for the camera to come back up before you can continue lighting the scene. Not to mention, even though you always calibrate your monitor, you don't always know for sure that the monitor that has been rented by you or the production is giving you a great rendition of what the image actually is in terms of exposure. I mean, a waveform is a much better tool for that. But I mean, yeah, I love my light meter. I can run ahead upstairs to the next room we're going to be shooting in and work with the gaffer to just pre-light roughly the units that we have standing by up there so that everything moves faster. And to do that with the camera, you'd have to break the camera off the sticks and take it all the way upstairs with you. So yeah, I think it's a really, really valuable tool and an accurate one and one that I just trust inherently.
Perfect. Guy Pools, director of photography for 2-Sentence Horror Stories. You guys can check that out on Netflix. And the new season on the CW app is where I found him. And I'm obviously the network as well. You can find him at Guy Pools, GUYPOOLES.com online. And of course, your Instagram, Guy Pools. Guy, thank you so much for being on. The show is awesome. And I'm so glad that you came on to talk about your experience.
Thank you. This was fun. Thank you for having me.
There he goes, Guy Pools, director of photography for 2-Sentence Horror Stories. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experiences. I also want to thank Matt Russell for mixing and mastering and making the show sound so good. You can find him at gainstructure.com, Gainstructure, and on Twitter at Gainstructure. You can also follow our producer, Connor Crosby, at ignitionvisuals.com. That's his website. You can find him on Twitter at Connor Crosby. And of course, follow us, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It's all there at Go Creative Show. You can have your questions heard on the show as well. And our sponsors, Premium Beat, Rule Boston Camera, Shutterstock, and Hedge. Support those that support us. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.